A Soviet-made T-62 main battle tank is displayed in the square of the Military Museum of the Chinese People's Revolution, a remarkable trophy. In the early spring of 1969, Soviet border guards invaded Zhenbao Island, Chinese territory. This tank entered an anti-tank minefield on the west bank of the Ussuri River, where Chinese troops were deployed, and its tracks were blown off. The Soviet army deployed a battalion in an attempt to tow it back and then tried to destroy it completely with artillery. The shells shattered the nearby ice, and the tank sank to the bottom of the river. Chinese border troops used a winch to pull it up from the riverbed. Zhenbao Island, located in Hulin County, Heilongjiang Province, is a sparsely populated area on China's northern border. Now, soldiers of a platoon from a border defense unit of the Shenyang military region are stationed on this small island. Near their garrison, remnants of the Soviet battle are scattered everywhere. In fact, the Soviet army fought a battle near Zhenbao Island that was far larger in scale than the Zhenbao Island conflict itself. However, during World War II, the Japanese Kwantung Army built the Huzhou Fortress in Huzhou Town, Hulin County, which the Japanese called the Maginot Line. In August 1945, the Soviet army invaded northeast China to fight against the Japanese and launched a strong attack on the Huzhou Fortress. Of the thousands of Kwantung Army soldiers defending the fortress, only about 50 survived. This battle is considered the last ground battle of World War II. And this location, which marked the end of the ground fighting in World War II, is only a few dozen kilometers away from Zhenbao Island. 20 years after the Battle of Huzhou, the Chinese and Soviet armies, which had fought side by side to annihilate the Kwantung Army, clashed at almost the same location. This was merely a border battle, yet it held the world in suspense. It was a military confrontation between two socialist superpowers, each possessing millions of conventional troops behind the border and a nuclear arsenal on each side. If the border battle were not controlled, no one could predict what scale of war it would escalate to. This is Zhenbao Island, only 0.74 square kilometers in size, which Westerners call the island that almost ignited a world war. The Zhenbao Island self-defense counterattack occurred during the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong was the principal founder and leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, and the People's Republic of China. In his later years, he misjudged the domestic and international situation and launched the Cultural Revolution. In the early stages of the revolution, he was exploited by the Lin Biao and Jiang Qing counter-revolutionary cliques, becoming exceptionally violent and uncontrollable. On August 18, 1966, Mao Zedong received Red Guards from all over the country for the first time at Tiananmen Square. Mao Zedong's active support for the Red Guard rebellion led to the rapid unification of scattered, sporadic rebellions across the country into a nationwide frenzy sweeping through tens of millions of young people under the unified organization of the Red Guards. Under the guise of one struggle, two criticisms, three reforms and destroying the four olds, many rules and regulations of the socialist superstructure, as well as historical and cultural heritage, were abolished and destroyed, causing immense chaos. Lin Biao, however, distorted the truth, claiming that this cultural revolution was the least costly, least successful, and the greatest victory. After the Central Committee approved his speech, the country descended into even greater chaos. At the time, Vietnam was engaged in a war of resistance against the United States, while China, amidst internal turmoil, still bore a heavy burden of international aid. At the request of the Vietnamese government, China not only provided substantial weapons and other supplies but also successively dispatched batches of air defense, engineering, railway, and logistics troops to Vietnam. Chinese troops fought almost face-to-face with American forces in Vietnam. In August 1967, the Hong Kong British authorities shut down 3 left-wing newspapers in Hong Kong, citing articles published in them opposing the continued British occupation of Hong Kong. The Chinese people, amidst internal turmoil and external threats, reacted with unusual sensitivity to the word humiliation. On August 22, the so-called anti-imperialist and anti-revisionist liaison station of the so-called proletarian revolutionaries in the capital gathered in front of the British Chargé d'Affaires in China. After the meeting, they set fire to the Chargé d'Affaires office building, causing a serious international incident. This not only damaged relations between China and Britain but also harmed China's foreign relations, international reputation, and national image. 3 years earlier, China had already acquired its own nuclear weapons. On October 16, 1964, China successfully detonated its first atomic bomb in western China. The Chinese considered themselves an invincible superpower. On June 17, 1967, China successfully detonated its first hydrogen bomb in its western region, making it one of the few countries in the world to possess such a weapon and breaking the nuclear monopoly of the US and the Soviet Union. Although the Chinese government repeatedly reiterated that its development of nuclear weapons was solely for defense and that it would never be the first to use them under any circumstances, the subtext was clear: China was capable of using its atomic bomb should it be threatened by foreign aggression. The tumultuous Cultural Revolution left China extremely isolated internationally, its surrounding security under increasing threat, and its military operations severely damaged. This was a period of extreme weakness for the Republic, forcing Mao Zedong to warn of the need to prepare for war. Moscow, 1968. On November 6, 1967, China's most authoritative newspaper at the time formally put forward the theory of continuing the revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat, advocating for continuous political revolutions where one class overthrows another. The following day was the Soviet October Revolution Day, and a grand military parade was held in Moscow's Red Square to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. During the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union's military strength matured rapidly. Even after the war, the Soviet Union maintained a large standing army, investing heavily in the modernization of its various branches: the Strategic Rocket Forces, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Air Defense Forces, through a continuous stream of new weapon systems. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was roughly equivalent to that of the United States, and while its conventional weapons were less advanced, their numbers far exceeded those of the US. While engaging in an arms race with the West led by the United States, the Soviet Union's military power expanded rapidly. Mao Zedong stated that the US and the Soviet Union were vying for world hegemony. Following this, the Soviet Union did something that shocked the world: the Prague Massacre. On August 20, 1968, Soviet transport planes parachuted into Prague Airport, the capital of Czechoslovakia, and seized the airport. Large numbers of paratroopers, light tanks, armored vehicles, and anti-tank guns were then continuously transported to Prague. Meanwhile, a combined force of 500,000 troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria forcibly crossed the Czechoslovakian border from the north, northeast, and south, taking control of the entire country by evening. From the Prague Massacre, China clearly saw that the Soviet Union had progressed to the point of using force to resolve ideological differences between socialist countries. As a socialist country with a long history of ideological disputes with the Soviet Union, China also tightened its guard for military confrontation. This is what Mao Zedong meant by preparing for war. First Secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Dubček, and Czech President Svoboda, among others, were all taken to Moscow by armed force to negotiate with Soviet leaders. This Soviet action was widely condemned around the world. Yugoslav President Tito, who had adhered to an independence policy since the open conflict between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, now had to guard against a potential Soviet invasion of Yugoslavia. Albania, bordering the Adriatic Sea, was also on high alert. This small mountainous country with a population of just over 1 million mobilized its entire population, ready for war, and simultaneously announced its withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, relinquishing all obligations stipulated in the treaty. At the time, Enver Hoxha was the first secretary of the Albanian Party of Labour, and Shu, chairman of the Council of Ministers of Albania, visited China during this period. China had only this one ally in Eastern Europe, whom the Chinese called a beacon of socialism in Europe. After the Soviet invasion of Prague, a slogan appeared on the streets of Prague: "Lenin, wake up. Brezhnev has gone mad." A few weeks later, Brezhnev did show some semblance of rationality, stating that the sovereignty of the socialist family was supreme, but the sovereignty of each individual state within it was limited. Western observers generally believed that this was a limited sovereignty argument to excuse the Soviet Union's armed intervention, and to a large extent, it was directed at China. China is a large country, and the Soviet Union was also a large country. The two large countries were connected, forming a land border of over 6,000 kilometers, the longest land border between two countries in the world. The Sino-Soviet border was divided into eastern and western sections. The eastern section bordered northeast China with the Soviet Far East, while the western section bordered Xinjiang with Central Asia. The western section of the Sino-Soviet border consisted mostly of vast Gobi Desert and open grasslands, with inconspicuous border markers. In some areas, there was only one boundary marker every 10 kilometers or so. During the period of Sino-Soviet friendship, the border was peaceful. Herdsmen on both sides would often inadvertently cross the border and graze on the other side's pastures, a situation that both sides tolerated and understood. However, after Sino-Soviet relations became tense, the situation changed drastically. The Soviet Union deployed helicopters to hover at extremely low altitudes, intimidating and driving away Chinese herds. Soviet border guards also used tractors to plow a buffer zone more than 10 meters wide along the border. If Chinese herdsmen's cattle and sheep approached or stepped onto this buffer zone, Soviet border guards would either open fire or, in more serious cases, deploy tanks to drive them away. Sometimes, Soviet troops would even cross the border and drive Chinese border residents' cattle and sheep onto the Soviet side. In the buffer zone, Soviet troops would even use armored vehicles to ram into Chinese border residents. All of this was deliberately orchestrated by the Soviet side to create tension and provoke incidents on the border. In the spring of 1962, China was experiencing economic hardship, and the people were struggling financially. The Soviet authorities took advantage of this difficult time to create border incidents. Xinjiang and the Soviet Central Asia region further west had always been home to various ethnic groups. While some residents on both sides of the Sino-Soviet border belonged to the same ethnic group, at this time, Soviet consulates in Ili and Urumqi, along with the Soviet Overseas Chinese Association, distributed over 100,000 overseas Chinese certificates in the Ili and Tachung areas, causing unrest among the Chinese border residents. A group of KGB agents, under the guise of visiting relatives and friends, recruited spies within China. On April 22, 1962, a riot broke out on the Sino-Soviet border. The Kyrgyz border crossing, not far from Yining City in Xinjiang, was a crucial passage along the western section of the Sino-Soviet border. The unrest in Kyrgyz spread to over 20 counties in 4 prefectures: Altai, Tachung, Bordala, and Ili. Along the more than 3,000-kilometer Sino-Soviet border, large numbers of Chinese border residents, some driving tractors, some on foot, and some riding in ox-drawn wooden carts, broke through the obstruction of Chinese cadres and border guards and poured into Soviet territory at several important border crossings. During the day, Soviet authorities used vehicles to pick them up, and at night they used searchlights to guide the influx of Chinese border residents. This situation lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. The Soviet Union coerced more than 67,000 Chinese border residents into entering the Soviet Union, leaving only a few hundred people in 2 counties within China. The events that occurred in the spring of 1962 on the western section of the Sino-Soviet border were the largest international exodus of border residents since World War II, and the trigger for the escalation of tensions along the entire Sino-Soviet border into full-scale conflict. Following this incident, Major General Zhulong Tayev, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Xinjiang Military Region, and Major General Malgov, Commander of the Ili Military Subdistrict, wrote reports requesting permission to travel to the Soviet Union, which was approved. Accompanying these 2 major generals were more than 40 officers of the Xinjiang Military Region at the colonel level. From then on the western side of the Sino-Soviet border, the Soviet border guards seemed to have established a certain psychological advantage and became increasingly confident. Xinjiang is connected to the interior of China only by the Lanzhou-Xinjiang Railway, which traverses the vast Gobi Desert, while there are no railway connections from the capital Urumqi to the major cities of the autonomous region. Under these circumstances, if a major conflict were to occur on the western section of the Sino-Soviet border, it would be difficult for China to mobilize large numbers of troops to the border region in a short period of time. The central and western parts of the Soviet Union contained industrial hubs such as Almaty and Tashkent, which could provide ample logistical support for the Soviet border troops. Associated Press reporter Ryan commented on the Soviet military's provocations in the Xinjiang border region of China, stating that the Soviets were far from satisfied with merely making minor moves on the Xinjiang border. Xinjiang possessed all the elements necessary to ignite a major war. Its area was equivalent to the combined land areas of Italy, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and it had abundant untapped strategic resources such as oil, coal, rare metals, and uranium needed to make atomic bombs. This region held extremely important geographical, political, military, and economic significance for both Beijing and Moscow. Therefore, separating Xinjiang from Red China was likely one of the Soviet Union's established goals. When Soviet border guards crossed the border to provoke, the border troops of the Xinjiang military region persisted in reasoned struggle, but the situation did not ease due to the reasoned arguments of the simple-minded Chinese soldiers. Instead, it continued to escalate. The eastern section of the Sino-Soviet border is mainly composed of three boundary rivers, the Irgun River, the Heilongjiang River, and the Ussuri River. China's shape on the map resembles a large rooster, and the three boundary rivers outline the rooster's comb. A 1968 Soviet map included over 600 islands, totaling more than 1,000 square kilometers, on the Ussuri and Amur rivers, which China claimed as its territory. TASS news agency even issued a statement on this matter. In Russian, the Amur River is called the Amur River. In 1968, the Amur Flotilla, under the Soviet Pacific Fleet, and Soviet border guards seized Haishazi Island, located at the confluence of the Amur and Ussuri rivers. They deployed warships to blockade the river, intercept Chinese vessels, plunder cargo, and forcibly deprive Chinese ships of their navigation rights. To avoid armed conflict, Chinese border patrol boats were forced to temporarily cease routine patrols in this area. Chinese vessels were rarely seen navigating this waterway, only a few Chinese fishermen were fishing on the river. Border negotiations between China and the Soviet Union had taken place, but they consistently failed to reach an agreement. China always wanted to maintain the status quo, but this was also difficult to maintain. So why did such a dispute arise on the Sino-Soviet border? From a broad historical perspective, the Sino-Soviet border dispute stems from Tsarist Russia's eastward expansion policy. While the last Tsar, Nicholas II, sent Russian troops to World War I, his Russia was already the largest country in the world. It is well known that until the Ming dynasty in China, Tsarist Russia was merely a small country located in a corner of Eastern Europe. From then on, Russia continuously expanded eastward, crossing the Bering Strait at the eastern end of Eurasia, and gradually seizing pieces of China's early territory. In the mid to late 20th century alone, Tsarist Russia forced the Qing government to sign the unequal treaties of Agun, Beijing, and Ili, forcibly ceding over 1.5 million square kilometers of land from China, including the area north of the Heilongjiang River, south of the Outer Khingan Mountains, east of the Ussuri River, and Xinjiang. Marx and Engels condemned Tsarist Russia's plunder of Chinese territory, calling them shameless robbers who so easily seized the richest region between the Dada Strait and Lake Baikal, an area equal in size to France and Germany, with a river as long as the Danube. In 1900, Russian troops, as part of the Eight-Nation Alliance, entered Beijing. While the Eight-Nation Alliance held a joint military parade in front of the Hall of Supreme Harmony in the Forbidden City, each nation had its own plans to plunder China. However, Russia's location seemed more advantageous than the other 7 nations, as it was the only neighboring country of China. Leveraging this geographical advantage, Russia occupied important cities in northeast China that October, aiming to realize Nicholas II's Yellow Russia plan. After the Eight-Nation Alliance forced the Qing government to sign the Boxer Protocol, Russia's series of blatant acts of aggression in northeast China pushed Japan, which had long coveted the region, to its breaking point. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, officially igniting an imperialist war on Chinese soil for control of northeast China. This war lasted over a year, its scale and casualties unprecedented in modern warfare. The Russo-Japanese War ended in Russian defeat, and Japan and Russia divided northeast China along the Changchun border, creating a confrontation between South and North Manchuria. In 1912, the princes of Outer Mongolia, with the support of Tsarist Russia, declared independence. However, in 1917, the October Revolution broke out in Russia, and Outer Mongolia returned to China. In September 1920, Lenin, representing the Soviet government, declared that Tsarist Russia's policies in China were criminal. All treaties previously concluded between Russian governments and China were invalid. All previously seized Chinese territory and all Russian concessions within China were relinquished, and everything seized from China by the Tsarist government and the Russian bourgeoisie was to be returned to China unconditionally and permanently. However, Lenin died prematurely, and Stalin became the main leader of the Soviet Party and state. Between 1924 and 1926, the Chinese nationalist government and the Soviet Russian government held several territorial talks. The important decision made by Lenin, under the new Soviet leadership, to return the Chinese territories seized by Tsarist Russia to China was no longer valid. Moreover, Stalin also desired to reclaim the rights Russia had lost in northeast China during the Russo-Japanese War. Towards the end of World War II, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union held the Yalta Conference, accepting Stalin's conditions for the Soviet military's war against Japan. These conditions included maintaining the status quo of Outer Mongolia's independence from China, the internationalization of the port of Dalian, the Soviet lease of the Port Arthur naval base, and joint Sino-Soviet operation of the Changchun Railway. These conditions, involving Chinese sovereignty, were secretly established by the three major powers in the Yalta Agreement without the knowledge of the Chinese people. In August 1945, after the Soviet Union invaded northeast China and annihilated the Kwantung Army, it obtained these rights. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, in December 1949, Mao Zedong went to Moscow to attend Stalin's 70th birthday celebrations and signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Assistance, and Alliance. During the talks between Mao and Stalin, the independence of Outer Mongolia was raised as an extremely sensitive issue. However, since the Kuomintang government had already agreed to Outer Mongolia's independence under the Yalta Agreement in August 1945, the new China had no choice but to accept it as a fait accompli. However, other provisions imposed on China by the Yalta Agreement were quickly abolished, and the Soviet Union agreed to return the Changchun Railway, jointly operated by China and the Soviet Union, to the new China free of charge. The two sides set a date for the withdrawal of the Soviet Navy from Lushan and stipulated that the equipment in the area would be transferred to the Chinese government, with the Chinese government paying for its restoration and reconstruction. Stalin died in Moscow on March 5, 1953. Shortly after Stalin's death, Khrushchev became first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and later chairman of the Council of Ministers. At the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, he delivered a secret report on the cult of personality and its consequences, completely repudiating Stalin. China objected, leading to a rift between the two parties. The CPSU extended this rift to the two countries, with the Soviet government unilaterally breaking the Sino-Soviet agreement and subsequently withdrawing all its experts working in China. In September 1959, a border incident occurred between China and India. The Chinese government explained the truth of the border conflict to the Soviet side. However, disregarding the relationship between the two parties, the Soviet Union's TASS news agency published a statement favoring India. Also in September of the same year, Khrushchev led a Soviet delegation to the United States. During the Camp David talks, U.S. President Eisenhower hoped that Khrushchev would exert pressure on the Chinese government on issues such as Taiwan and the development of nuclear weapons, to which Khrushchev complied. In November 1960, delegations from 81 communist and workers' parties gathered in Moscow to celebrate the 43rd anniversary of the October Socialist Revolution. Liu Shaoqi led the CCP delegation to the meeting. Prior to the meeting, the Soviet leadership distributed a 60,000-word letter to delegates from various parties, launching a brutal attack on the Chinese Communist Party and provoking sharp debate. Furthermore, the Soviet government demanded that China repay the debts incurred from purchasing weapons during the Korean War. It should be noted that it was precisely because the Chinese army fought and bled on the Korean battlefield that a head-on collision between the US and the Soviet Union was prevented. Faced with this situation, the Chinese government decided to tighten its belt and repay the debt, which not only exacerbated China's economic difficulties but also deeply hurt the feelings of the Chinese people towards their Soviet big brother. The border dispute between China and the Soviet Union, dating back to the 17th century, remained unresolved, and China had been striving to find a reasonable way to resolve the issue. In Lenin's time, Lenin handled the border issue with a broad proletarian perspective. In Stalin's time, there was still room for negotiation, but during Khrushchev's rule, it became difficult for the two sides to sit down and talk, and during Brezhnev's party and government, force became the only means to resolve the differences. When relations between countries are tense, territorial issues are often the outlet for pent-up frustration. Brezhnev, who succeeded Khrushchev to power, not only did not intend to resolve the historical territorial disputes between China and the Soviet Union, but also amassed military power and created new territorial demands. Zhenbao Island is located in Hulin County, Heilongjiang Province, on the Chinese side of the main channel of the Ussuri River, with an area of 0.74 square kilometers. The northern end of the island was originally connected to the Chinese mainland, but due to erosion by the river, it only became a small island in 1915. It is narrow at both ends and wide in the middle, resembling an ancient Chinese ingot, hence the name Zhenbao Island. A river branch several tens of meters wide on the west side of the island remains connected to the Chinese bank during the dry season. However, the Soviet government at the time drew its border line on the Chinese side of the Ussuri River, including Zhenbao Island within its territory. Chinese border troops have always patrolled the Zhenbao Island area. The island is guarded by the Hejiang Military Subdistrict Border Station in Heilongjiang Province, commanded by Xiang Sun Yuguo, who has only about 30 soldiers under his command. Opposite Zhenbao Island were the Soviet border guard posts of Kulebyakunai and Shemikalovka, with over 200 personnel and equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, and automobiles. Helicopters were also available for use in emergencies. From January 1967 to February 1969, Soviet border troops intruded into Zhenbao Island 16 times, engaging in armed provocations. They deployed 2 to 3 times more troops than the Chinese border guards, intercepting and beating Chinese border soldiers on routine patrols, forcing them to leave. They used armored vehicles carrying fully armed Soviet soldiers to ram Chinese patrols, obstructing their duties, and wounding Chinese border guards. To prevent the situation from escalating, Chinese border troops suspended patrols in late February 1969. On the night of March 1, a Chinese reconnaissance unit quietly infiltrated the western end of Zhenbao Island. On the morning of March 2, Border Station Chief Sun Yuguo led a patrol unit to resume routine patrols on the island. The Chinese patrol was ordered not to fire the first shot. Upon observation, the Soviet troops immediately dispatched over 70 men from the border posts of Shemikalovka and Kulebyakunai, rushing to the eastern end of the island to block the Chinese patrol's path. The Soviet troops deployed into battle formation upon disembarking, splitting into 3 groups. Besides advancing from the front, they also moved to the left and right flanks of the Chinese patrol, preparing to encircle them. Seeing the aggressive Soviet advance, the border post commander, Sun Yuguo, issued warnings and ordered the patrol to retreat to the western end of the island, the location where the Chinese reconnaissance team had laid an ambush. The island was small, and the patrol quickly retreated to the western side, finding no way to retreat. The Soviet troops pursued relentlessly. Seeing the Soviets raise their guns, Sun Yuguo realized they were about to attack and ordered the patrol to prepare for battle. The Soviets fired first, killing and wounding 6 Chinese border guards. Chinese border troops decisively issued a counterattack order. Patrol units and ambushing reconnaissance units immediately opened fire simultaneously. The Soviet troops, caught off guard by the ambush on the west side of the island, were unable to fully utilize their firepower advantage. On the other side of the island, a second group of Chinese border patrols clashed with a 7-man Soviet squad on the ice. Upon hearing the battle begin, the Chinese border guards acted swiftly, killing all 7 Soviet soldiers. At this moment, a Soviet armored vehicle rushed in, driving directly onto Zhenbao Island. The armored vehicle advanced along the riverbank until it reached the flank and rear of the Chinese border troops, posing a threat. The Chinese border troops concentrated artillery fire from both sides of the riverbank, driving the armored vehicle away. The Chinese troops decided to launch an attack and then retreat. The reconnaissance and patrol units launched an assault, and the Soviet troops began to retreat, eventually returning to the main channel of the river, before boarding their armored vehicles and returning to Soviet territory. This occurred during the armed conflict on Zhenbao Island on March 2. The Soviet Union suffered 31 dead and 14 wounded, while the Chinese suffered 20 dead, causing a rapid deterioration in Sino-Soviet relations. That same day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China sent a note to the Soviet embassy in China, lodged a strong protest against the Soviet border troops' incursion into Zhenbao Island. The note stated that the Chinese government firmly demanded that the Soviet government hold the perpetrators accountable for this incident and immediately cease its violations of Chinese territory and armed provocations. Simultaneously, the Soviet government also sent a note to the Chinese government, with a similar tone, demanding severe punishment for the instigators of this provocation. For many years, in the Sino-European standoff, the Soviet military placed great emphasis on the mobility of its troops, giving it a clear advantage from the outset of war. During its armed invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union had already demonstrated to the world its ability to rapidly assemble a powerful army. This time, the Far East's railway and strategic airlift capabilities were fully mobilized, converging on the Ussuri River. Within just a few days, Soviet forces rapidly concentrated in the Zhenbao Island area, including 70 tanks, 380 artillery pieces, 150 armored vehicles and self-propelled guns, and over 10,000 infantry. Another major battle was imminent at Zhenbao Island. China anticipated that the Soviet army, eager to save face, would likely invade again. On the night of March 14, Chinese border troops laid anti-tank minefields on the frozen riverbank and dispatched an 11-man detachment to lie in ambush on an unnamed hill on the west side of the island. Coincidentally, the Soviet army had also planned an ambush, but acted a little too late. In the early morning of March 15, a Soviet detachment of over 30 men quietly landed on the island and lay in ambush in the northeastern jungle. On the morning of March 15, Sun Yiguo led a patrol detachment onto the island and then patrolled from south to north. Knowing they were under the guns of the ambushing Soviet troops, they deliberately maintained a distance that was neither too close nor too far, luring the Soviet troops to fire first. After the gunfire, the Soviet ambush position was exposed. Guided by 6 armored vehicles, the Soviet troops on the opposite bank of the river rushed along the frozen river towards Sun Yiguo's patrol detachment's hiding place. The Soviet advance inadvertently exposed its flank to the Chinese ambush force. When the Chinese ambush force suddenly opened fire, the Soviet vanguard was caught off guard. 2 Soviet soldiers froze to death in this ambush, and the ambush site was right under the Chinese's noses. On this turbulent morning, fierce fighting raged for over an hour. 2 Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed, and the remaining troops withdrew to the opposite bank. The first Soviet attack was repelled. At 9:46 a.m., the Soviets launched their second attack. After the Soviet ambush force withdrew, Soviet artillery bombarded the small Zhenbao Island. Under artillery cover, the Soviets deployed 6 tanks and 5 armored vehicles, leading infantry in a 2-pronged assault on Zhenbao Island. One force, consisting of 2 tanks and 5 armored vehicles, attacked from the northern end of the island, while the other force, with 4 tanks, maneuvered along the southern river branch, attempting to block the river, prevent Chinese reinforcements, and encircle and annihilate the Chinese border guards on the island. Due to the exceptionally fierce firepower of the Soviet attack, the Chinese troops on the island suffered heavy casualties. The Soviets attacked in 2 columns, while artillery and heavy machine guns from the shore blocked the river crossing, initially achieving their objective. 4 Soviet tanks bypassed the southern tip of the island, flanking the Chinese border guards from the river crossing. Their tracks were severed by anti-tank mines positioned behind the border guards, which explains why the Chinese army destroyed the tracks of the Soviet T-62 main battle tanks. Under the threat of being attacked from both sides by the Soviets, the small Chinese detachment holding the island, in coordination with the shore-based covering forces, concentrated their firepower on the Soviet tanks. After more than 2 hours of fierce fighting, the second Soviet attack was repelled. The Chinese border guards also suffered heavy casualties, and a stretcher-bearer team composed of educated youth from the 21st Regiment of the Heilongjiang Production and Construction Corps was deployed. At 3:13 p.m., the Soviets launched their third attack. After a 15-minute artillery barrage, with firepower suppressing a front of 10 kilometers and a depth of 7 kilometers, 24 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles led a company of troops aggressively towards Zhenbao Island. The battle entered its most brutal phase, with soldiers from both sides fighting desperately for this little-known island. A Soviet lieutenant colonel and a colonel were killed in the battle. Chinese artillery fired over 1,200 shells, destroying or damaging numerous Soviet tanks and armored vehicles, inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviet forces, and repelling the Third Soviet Offensive. Just over half a month after the Zhenbao Island self-defense counterattack, the 9th National Congress of the Communist Party of China was held in Beijing. The Congress was permeated with a strong atmosphere of personality cult and leftist fervor, legitimizing the theory and practice of the Cultural Revolution and strengthening the positions of Lin Biao, Jiang Qing, and others within the party Central Committee. Because the Congress made exaggerated predictions about the possibility of war, the Zhenbao Island delegates received special attention. Sun Yuguo, the border station chief, was specially invited to attend the meeting, representing the frontier soldiers still enduring the hardships of Zhenbao Island. Therefore, he appeared particularly excited when he stepped onto the podium. Both Lin Biao and Jiang Qing had initially ignored the Zhenbao Island incident. Afterwards, they were acutely aware of its significance in the Chinese political situation at the time. For their own political needs, this grassroots commander was forcibly promoted to a rocket soldier. The political report of the 9th Congress included preparations for an early and large-scale nuclear war with the U.S. imperialists and Soviet revisionists. Dr. Kissinger's memoirs revealed the U.S. government's reaction. Since the Korean War, China has consistently considered the United States its primary enemy. However, this time, it has also listed the Soviet Union as a major belligerent in a future war, suggesting that what the Chinese are truly wary of is Soviet revisionism. The Zhenbao Island conflict was a small spark between two enormous powder kegs, yet it put both major powers on high alert. Among the 5 branches of the Soviet armed forces, the strategic rocket forces were the most powerful, forming the world's largest missile force. Below the strategic rocket forces was the Army, the largest branch in terms of personnel. In the late 1960s, it had 1.82 million personnel. Of this total, motorized infantry divisions accounted for 70%, tank divisions 25%, and airborne divisions 5%. According to intelligence released by the U.S. Department of Defense, since the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union had implemented a program to improve the quality of its ground forces to ensure their ability to carry out offensive missions. The program was extremely broad, encompassing a large-scale improvement in mobility, firepower, striking power, command and control over obstacles, air defense capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, and logistical support. The Soviet defense budget allocated to this program increased year after year. During the Cultural Revolution, China's military work suffered severe setbacks and losses. However, with national security threatened and domestic turmoil raging, the military had to resist and eliminate all interference, overcome all difficulties, and strive to strengthen combat readiness. Following the Zhenbao Island self-defense counterattack, the Central Military Commission organized a series of large-scale simulated combat exercises, particularly large-scale exercises simulating multi-pronged tank assaults against Soviet ground forces, based on their potential invasion directions and operational characteristics. Special emphasis was placed on tank assaults and exercises involving air assaults and parachute drops. Given the Soviet Union's armed provocations along the border, the Central Committee further emphasized the importance of combat readiness, proposing preparations for a war of resistance against aggression. The people were warned against attacking troops, and the research and production of medium tanks, fighter jets, and bombers were accelerated, quickly equipping the troops. After the Zhenbao Island self-defense counterattack, Mao Zedong believed the international situation might deteriorate and further emphasized the importance of combat readiness. Mao Zedong once said, "Our country should not have the mentality of great power hegemony, but in domestic construction, we must earnestly do a good job in combat readiness, and further improve air defense fortifications." This further fueled the existing war preparedness fervor, shifting China's economic strategic focus entirely to war preparedness. While the entire nation was gearing up for war, Lin Biao seized the opportunity, believing a Soviet surprise attack was possible. On October 17, 1969, he unilaterally issued an emergency directive in Suzhou to strengthen war preparedness and prevent a surprise attack, demanding the entire army enter a state of emergency readiness, expedite weapons production, and equip command headquarters with wartime command positions. This order caused a major shock throughout the country. Following the issuance of the first order, the entire nation entered a state of emergency readiness, with troops ready for immediate combat. China was mired in internal turmoil and instability, and the initiative in the war was in Moscow's hands. The Soviet Army, which originally had 12 divisions stationed along the Sino-Soviet border, increased its forces to 55 divisions in the Army, 24 air defense divisions, and 130,000 naval personnel several months after the Zhenbao Island conflict. Missile targets were also adjusted. The Soviet Union's missile targets were primarily NATO, but it now also deployed 35 missile bases in Asia. Of these, 10 were intercontinental ballistic missile bases and 25 were medium-range missile bases, most of which were targeted at China. Although Brezhnev had his sights set on China, his strategic focus remained on the US-led NATO and was unlikely to shift eastward. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union's missile force was clearly inferior to that of the United States. However, by the late 1960s, the US and the Soviet Union were roughly equal in terms of ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The only difference was that the Soviet ICBMs had poor accuracy and were mostly housed in unfortified silos, making them vulnerable to attack. However, the Soviet Union possessed an unparalleled geographical advantage. As a European country, it did not need to use ICBMs. Its medium and long-range missiles deployed within its territory and in its Eastern European satellite states could destroy strategic targets and military facilities within NATO's European borders. The United States, separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean, would likely be overwhelmed if the Soviet Union attacked Western Europe from Central Europe. 1969 was the first year of Richard Nixon's term, and he had to do something to break the deadlock between the US and the Soviet Union. Of course, the best leverage is China. Even before becoming president, he wrote in a foreign policy journal that this small planet cannot tolerate 700 million of the most talented Chinese living in angry isolation. However, the US military was fighting in Vietnam, while China steadfastly supported Vietnam. As long as the Vietnam issue existed, there were few opportunities for the US and China to move closer. According to Kissinger's memoirs, the first signs of rapprochement between the US and China appeared in 1968 after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, when China strongly condemned the Soviet Union. China had acted as a peacemaker since the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. This gave Americans their first sense of common ground with the Chinese on major international issues. Then, Nixon hinted at the possibility of US-China dialogue in his inaugural address, reiterating the old argument that a nation cannot live in angry isolation. Unfortunately, the Chinese at the time were not moved by this vague statement. But after the Zhenbao Island incident, the situation changed. The Chinese strengthened their defense research and were also vigorously developing missiles. The Chinese were increasingly under the nuclear threat of the Soviet Union, and a tacit understanding developed between them and the United States, which was also under Soviet nuclear deterrence. At this critical moment, a still oblivious Brezhnev committed a foolish act that accelerated the process of Sino-US reconciliation. The Soviet armed invasion of Prague, the Prague Incident. After provoking China's northeastern border, the Soviet Union created further trouble in the Tia-Likity region of northwestern Xinjiang. Tia-Likity was a crucial passage for Chinese border patrols. The Chinese border troops were aware of the Soviet Army's intentions and reported their concerns to the Xinjiang military region, suggesting the cancellation of routine patrols in Tia-Likity. However, the military region failed to provide clear instructions. On the morning of August 13, 1969, Deputy Company Commander Yang Zenlin led 37 soldiers on a routine patrol when they were ambushed and annihilated by Soviet troops 10 kilometers east of Tia-Likity. All were killed. That evening, the news was broadcast on the Central People's Broadcasting Station's evening news program, along with the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs protest note to the Soviet embassy in China. Upon hearing the news, Beijing residents did not hold large-scale demonstrations or shout slogans to express their righteous indignation. The era of such protests was over. Instead, a nationwide upsurge of war preparedness erupted, with the entire population mobilized for war. People dug underground, preparing for conflict. Several years earlier, due to an overestimation of the international situation, Mao Zedong emphasized the importance of war preparedness. He stressed the need to stockpile grain and cloth, dig air raid shelters, and build fortifications. Based on these directives, in August 1969, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China officially decided to establish a nationwide People's Air Defense Leading Group, and various provinces, municipalities, and autonomous regions also established their own at various levels. A nationwide campaign to dig air raid shelters and trenches was launched, leading to a rapid expansion of civil defense projects and a continuous improvement in their standards. Mao Zedong, emulating the advice given by the hermit Zhu Sheng to Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang of the Ming dynasty, build high walls, store ample grain, and delay declaring oneself king, adopted the strategy of dig deep tunnels, store ample grain, and do not seek hegemony. For a time, the entire nation was engulfed in a frenzy of digging tunnels, so much so that many of these nuclear bunkers were later converted into underground shopping malls in major cities. From a grand strategic perspective, the 38 Chinese soldiers at Tialikiti, who fought to the death during the Soviet invasion, inadvertently pried open a huge lever, creating a tiny crack in the door to a different global strategic order. While the spirits of these 38 loyal soldiers still lingered in China's northwest border region, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Richardson delivered a speech that Kissinger called a revolutionary step, stating that continuously improving relations with China was in the national interest of the United States. Simultaneously, the U.S. government, through Pakistani President Yahya, conveyed a message to Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai that the U.S. was willing to improve relations with China. However, due to the long-standing and understandable antagonism between China and the U.S., the Pakistani channel never relayed any information back to China. The Soviet Union amassed 1 million troops on the Sino-Soviet border and was vying for global hegemony with the United States. Faced with a rapidly rising military giant, both China and the United States were forced to align themselves. But Brezhnev was still releasing probes. Victor, a prominent Soviet freelance journalist, said that the Soviet Union might launch a surgical strike on China's Lop Nua nuclear base, and if this happened, the world would only know afterward. This was tantamount to implying a preemptive Soviet attack, a surprise nuclear retaliatory strike against China, and that the Soviet Union was releasing these probes to gauge the Chinese government's reaction. The Chinese government indeed reacted quickly. On September 28 and 29, 1969, U.S. seismic monitoring stations, Soviet seismic monitoring centers, and satellites from both countries almost simultaneously received powerful seismic signals. They immediately concluded that China had successfully conducted its first underground nuclear test and a high-explosive nuclear test, its 8th and 9th nuclear tests, respectively. However, for several days, all Chinese news media remained silent, as if nothing had happened. The Associated Press commented on this unusual phenomenon, saying that China's 2 recent tests were not for achieving any particular result, but rather a pre-war check. This was Beijing's response to Moscow's probes. Within the Soviet military, a group of hawks consistently advocated for a war first, then negotiation approach towards China. At this point, they had also begun to assess China's strength. Brezhnev was truly worried. This master of the Kremlin was facing a confident and proud China unlike any other czar had ever encountered. The newly established People's Republic of China would not sign a humiliating treaty with any invader. A revitalized China in the 20th century was not afraid of military blackmail, nor of atomic bombs. On the Sino-Soviet border, the Soviet army was on high alert, with alarm bells blaring. In the border region, the Soviet General Staff deployed 55 infantry divisions, 12 operational rocket divisions, 10 tank divisions, and 4 Air Force Corps, totaling over 1 million troops. The Soviet army possessed powerful conventional weaponry and could trigger war at any time. The headquarters of the Chinese People's Liberation Army promptly notified the entire army of this situation, using the phrase "1 million Soviet troops are pressing in, their ambition to destroy us remains undiminished." China had a standing army of 5 million, the largest in the world, along with a vast militia. At the time, it was said that 800 million people, 800 million soldiers, 10,000 miles of land, 10,000 miles of camps. In that era, this was not merely a slogan. If China were to allow its adversaries to enter the fray, and a people's war were to erupt everywhere, any force would be bogged down in a quagmire. During World War II, once the overall situation on the European front was settled, the Soviet Army concentrated its forces in the Far East to annihilate the Kwantung Army. The Trans-Siberian Railway operated day and night for months, reaching its limit, before it could assemble 3 army groups totaling 1.5 million troops and corresponding equipment in the Far East. Now, no matter where the Soviet Army concentrated its forces on the Sino-Soviet border, the country's transportation capacity and logistical support would be far from sufficient. More importantly, the Soviet Army's primary hypothetical enemy for a long time was the United States, and Soviet forces were mainly deployed on the Western Front. This overarching objective was unchangeable. The United States possessed intercontinental ballistic missiles with long range and high accuracy, and its multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle technology was far superior to that of the Soviet Union. Coupled with the long-term priority given to developing early warning systems, this resulted in an intercontinental ballistic missile system that was difficult for the enemy to destroy, yet capable of accurately destroying them. For the Soviet Union, the main threat came from the United States, which was constantly targeting it, not from China, which had no desire to seize an inch of foreign land. Deploying too much military force in the China direction would inevitably neglect the main danger zone. In late 1960s Moscow, the Soviet Union was deeply troubled. Brezhnev, who held power in Moscow, was as emotional as Khrushchev. He acted too hastily on the China issue, and after only a few steps, he found himself in a dead end. Nuclear deterrence was not a problem for China, and a conventional war was certainly unwinnable. This situation seemed inescapable. To safeguard NATO, a key priority, Moscow was willing to sit down and talk with Beijing. As a superpower, it naturally could not be subservient. It was looking for an opportunity. On September 2, 1969, Ho Chi Minh, a close friend of the Chinese people and chairman of the Workers' Party of Vietnam, passed away in Hanoi. The Vietnamese people held a grand memorial service for Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi. Both China and the Soviet Union sent high-level party and government delegations to participate. Ho Chi Minh joined the Communist Party in France in 1920 and had close contact with both the Soviet Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party during his turbulent revolutionary career. It is said that after Premier Zhou Enlai arrived in Hanoi, Premier Pham Van Dong conveyed Ho Chi Minh's dying wish to him: "Elder brother and elder sister, please stop fighting." Soviet Premier Kosygin also attended Ho Chi Minh's funeral. Kosygin hoped to take this opportunity to meet with Zhou Enlai, but Zhou Enlai returned to his country that evening. On September 11th, on his way back to Moscow from Hanoi, Kosygin met with Premier Zhou Enlai at Beijing Capital International Airport. They talked for 55 minutes, exchanging views on the border and bilateral relations. Both prime ministers agreed that the principal disputes between China and the Soviet Union should not hinder the normalization of relations between the two countries, and that neither country should use force over the border issue. Both sides agreed that a provisional agreement on maintaining the status quo of the border, preventing armed conflict, and disengaging troops from both sides in disputed border areas should be signed first, followed by negotiations to resolve the border issue. Li Shenyan and Xie Fuzi represented China at the talks. Kutuzov and Yasnov represented the Soviet Union. On November 7, the People's Daily published a statement from the Chinese government, stating that the Chinese government had consistently advocated for a peaceful resolution of the Sino-Soviet border issue through negotiations. According to the agreement between the two prime ministers, vice-ministerial-level border negotiations would begin in Beijing that year. Kissinger, in his memoirs, revealed that the meeting between the Chinese and Soviet prime ministers and the holding of vice-ministerial-level border negotiations touched a nerve in the United States, causing President Nixon considerable unease. A Sino-Soviet détente was clearly detrimental to the United States, and he wanted to gauge China's position, but there was no news from China through Pakistani channels. In desperation, he even asked Romanian President Ceausescu to convey the United States' desire for de-escalation to China. What reassured Nixon was that the Sino-Soviet vice-ministerial and border negotiations had not reached any agreement, and there were no signs of easing in Sino-Soviet relations. Large Soviet troops remained stationed in the Sino-Soviet border region, showing no intention of withdrawing to Europe. Even more reassuring for Nixon was that the Soviet Union was seeking a pretext to attack China. They published articles stating that socialist countries had the right to interfere in each other's affairs for their own interests or the interests of those threatened countries. The Soviet army had been observing the situation along the Sino-Soviet border, monitoring the movements of the Chinese army, and routinely reporting to their superiors. However, they had little understanding of what was about to happen in the world. In April 1971, while the Soviet General Staff was holding a meeting, the 31st World Table Tennis Championships were being held in Nagoya, Japan. During the competition, the head of the Chinese table tennis delegation extended an invitation to American player Cohen to take a free trip to China. This is what is known worldwide as ping-pong diplomacy. The American table tennis team traveled from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, and then flew from Guangzhou to Beijing. Cohen quoted Chairman Mao, "We have ignited a prairie fire." The table tennis team stayed at the Zhenbao Hotel in Beijing and watched the model opera ballet The Red Detachment of Women and the Peking Opera taking Tiger Mountain by strategy at the Great Hall of the People. On April 14, Premier Zhou Enlai met with them and told them that we had turned a new page in the relations between the Chinese and American people, adding that American journalists could now come to China in batches. George W. Bush, a brilliant and moderate politician, also played ping-pong. Before the formal establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, he served as the head of the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing, a position that marked a turning point in his political career. This experience directly influenced his later presidency. On the same day the U.S. ping-pong team left Beijing, President Nixon announced the easing of the 20-year-old U.S. trade embargo against China, and Beijing resumed telephone calls between Washington and London. Immediately following, the Pakistani channel suddenly opened. Zhou Enlai conveyed through Pakistan that Beijing agreed to receive the U.S. President's special envoy. This was a top political secret between China and the United States at the time. After careful arrangements, President Nixon's national security advisor, Kissinger, after touring Southeast Asia, suddenly arrived in Rawalpindi, the capital of Pakistan, and then boarded a Pakistani passenger plane to China, where he held talks with Premier Zhou Enlai on July 9. On July 15, both sides jointly issued a communiqué announcing that President Nixon had accepted the invitation to visit China in the near future. Kissinger's secret visit paved the way for President Nixon's trip to China, where he subsequently visited 10 times and met with Mao Zedong 5 times. At the time, Mao Zedong was concerned about the Soviet Union, stating that the possibility of the United States launching an invasion was currently very small. The implication was clear: the Soviet Union was his biggest concern. The shockwaves of Sino-US rapprochement caused significant changes in the world political landscape. At the UN General Assembly on October 26 of that year, a proposal by Albania and other countries to accept China and expel Taiwan passed by an overwhelming majority. The Nixon administration's proposal for dual representation of China and Taiwan was not even put to a vote. Clearly, the United States was simultaneously helping China join the UN while pretending to be working to prevent Taiwan's expulsion. On February 21, 1972, Zhou Enlai and other Chinese party and state leaders arrived at Nanyuan Airport. U.S. President Nixon and his wife, along with Secretary of State Rogers, Dr. Kissinger, and others, boarded Air Force One, flying across the vast Pacific Ocean. After a brief stop in Shanghai, they flew to Beijing. The plane landed at Beijing Nanyuan Airport. They were there to seek the normalization of Sino-US relations. Nixon and his wife walked out of the cabin and down the stairs. He smiled and extended his arm, and Zhou Enlai reciprocated. Nixon recalled that, given Secretary of State Dulles' refusal to shake hands with Zhou Enlai 18 years earlier during the Geneva Conference, he deliberately extended his hand from a distance this time. Kissinger later said that to emphasize this historic moment, a burly aide stood in the aisle of Air Force One, waiting until President Nixon's historic handshake with Zhou Enlai had ended before the rest of the American delegation appeared as if by magic.